All right, everyone. Thumos Awareness Week continues here at the Stoa. Today we have Victor Saenz with us. Victor is an executive director at the Houston Institute and a lecturer at Rice University's philosophy department. And his interest is primarily on the history of ancient Greek philosophy and currently thinking about how Aristotle understands desire. And I invited him to the Stoa and specifically to Thumos Awareness Week because of his paper, Shame and Honor, Aristotle's Thumos as a Basic Desire. And it's a good paper, and I'm excited to chat with Victor about it. So how today is going to work, I'm going to tag in Victor in a moment. He's going to share his screen, I do a little presentation, then we're going to pivot to Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Victor. And if you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, I can read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Victor, welcome to the Stoa.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. It's a joy. When I saw Peter's invitation about Thumos Awareness Week, my immediate reaction was like, wow, I did not know this was a thing, but it's so great that it's a thing. So delighted to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see here. And people see my PowerPoint? Yes. Give me a thumbs up. Okay, terrific. So I'm going to go to slideshow. Let's see here. Okay, so good. So if you're here for Stats 101, this is not your place. We're here for Aristotle's Thumos, Shame, Anger, Honor, and Community. So what's our road ahead? So first, I want us to think a little bit about we're thinking about Thumos and kind of the implications of Thumos for Aristotle and for us. I think we need to zoom out a little bit first and just think about how Aristotle thinks humans are fundamentally like, right? So if we're going to understand what Thumos is and the role it plays, we need to place it in broader context, and specifically in the context of Aristotle's account of the tripartite soul. I think you guys had Josh Wilburn speaking about Thumos and Plato. So for those of you who are here for that, this should be familiar. Second, I want us to kind of zoom in more specifically on different places where Aristotle tells us the role that he thinks Thumos is playing in human psychology, right? So having gotten kind of the context of the tripartite soul, we'll zoom in on what Aristotle thinks Thumos is doing. Third one of the big questions that Aristotle will place for us is, what does it mean to, as it were, do Thumos well, right? So one of the running themes throughout this presentation, right, will be that, for Aristotle, Thumos is just kind of part of your basic motivational package. Like, you're not going to get rid of it, right? And it's in this sense, it's kind of like the desire for hunger, or desire for food, desire for drink, right? It's like, okay, you can use those better or worse ways, right? But you're not going to get rid of them, right? So for Aristotle, the central question is, how do we shape this in a way that's genuinely conducive to human flourishing, right? So that's what we want to think about here. Then we want to kind of, having looked at that in a kind of a general level, we want to focus on some of the virtues that Aristotle thinks are distinctive to Thumos. So there, we'll talk about the virtue of courage. We'll talk about magnanimity. We'll talk about mildness. There's others, but those are the ones that I think are most central. Then finally, so I was asking Peter a little bit about the audience here, and he was telling me, it's like, oh, these are really smart, great people, but they want stuff that's actionable, right? So I figured, let me bring in some practical conclusions of what Aristotle thinks this has to do with you and me. So everybody with me? Yes. Good. So let's jump straight in. So here's first a text from Aristotle. I'm going to be quoting Aristotle a lot because this is a presentation on Thumos and Aristotle. So Aristotle says in the De Anima that desire is the genus of which appetite, Thumos, which I leave untranslated, and wish are the species, right? So if we're asking what is Thumos, so Thumos falls into this broader category of desire, right? Where desire is a thing that basically any and all animals that have even just a sense of touch have some kind of desire, right? So big category is desire. So we want to understand, okay, what role is thumos playing in this account of desire, and how is it different from other desire types? So let's go through each of these in turn. One big thing to contrast here is that for Aristotle, something that makes us humans different from other animals is this ability to use reason, right? So running theme in thinking about thumos is going to be, how is thumos responding to reason or not, right? So here's a lovely quote from the Politics. Now, that man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal who has the gift of speech. The power of speech serves to reveal the expedient and the inexpedient, and therefore likewise the just and the unjust. And it is characteristic of man that he alone has any sense of good and evil, of just and unjust, right? So what does this tell us already pretty immediately is that if we look at, here, we can contrast wish with thumos and appetite. In what sense? In that wish, for Aristotle, wish is sometimes translated just as rational desire, right? So wish is those desires that we have as distinctively human, right? Whereas appetite and thumos are desires that as a type we share with other animals, even if we experience them in distinctively human form, right? So again, think about something like desire for food, right? So we share this with other animals, even if we experience it in distinctively human form, like I might have desire for caviar or something like that, right? But we share the desire for food and drink with other animals. So here, if we think about appetite, spirit, and rational desire, one way to think about the distinction is, as I mentioned, rational and irrational. So let's go through each of these in turn. So appetite, Aristotle tells us, is the desire to aim at what is pleasant and avoid what is painful, right? Paradigm objects are food, drink, and sex, but also things like desire for shelter, material possessions, insofar as they become associated with the pleasure of fulfilling basic drives. So the thought is, like, if you think about kind of the desires that are most rudimentary in the kind of scale of possible desires, appetite is at the very bottom, right? Even if you think about, like, what kinds of cognitive resources does an animal need to to have a desire for food or drink, all things equal, not that many, right? So in contrast, here's where we kind of are able to home in to see what makes thumos different. So thumos is a type of desire that presupposes that the animal is both aware of itself, aware of its relation to a group, and that the relation is experienced as positively or negatively balanced, right? So think about like a dog or something like this, right? So a dog is an extremely social animal, right? It's going to be aware of where it stands relative to the group. Am I the alpha dog? Am I the beta dog? Am I at the bottom of the totem pole, right? So thumos is this kind of much more cognitively sophisticated awareness of where I stand relative to others in different domains, right? So Aristotle is very much of the view, again, that we share this, sophisticated as it is, with other animals, right? And interesting for us, kind of paradigm objects for thumos in rational animals like us are things like a sense of honor, and avoidance of shame. So things like this. So we'll talk more about that momentarily. And then finally, I was mentioning this earlier with the Politics passage, we have rational desire, or sometimes translated wish. So it's worth noting here, so as to not kind of caricature Aristotle's views, that so Aristotle is keenly aware and very much of the view that non-rational animals, as he calls them, are extremely cognitively sophisticated. So he has no qualms about that, right? But what makes irrational desire different on his view is that humans, unlike other animals, he claims, are capable of conceptual thought, right? So think about not just like pleasant and painful, but think about like that was unjust, that was ungrateful of him, right? Or that's not just a tree in front of me, but it's like many other trees. This is an oak tree, right? So that kind of ability of conceptual thought is what makes us different on his view. So let's look a little bit about how does Thumos manifest itself? So kind of homing in a little bit more on Thumos, so that we can then go back to ask the question, what does it look like to shape Thumos well, right? What does it mean to have Thumos follow reason, right? So here's a couple of different ways in which Thumos manifests itself for Aristotle. So first example is anger. I'm sure nobody here is angry ever. The interesting thing is that this is probably the single most common example of Thumos that Aristotle uses, right? So, and if we wonder, why is this an aspect of Thumos? Just as I think it becomes much clearer once we see how Aristotle defines anger, right? So, anger, he says, may be defined as a desire accompanied by pain for apparent revenge, for an apparent slight at the hands of men who have no call to slight oneself or one's friends, right? So, in other words, I get angry when somebody has called into question my place in the social rank, right? If somebody calls into question my place in the social rank, where the person has basically no right to do so, right? I'm like, hey, what the heck, right? So again, anger even though it might seem to us sometimes like a relatively simple emotion, is actually pretty sophisticated, right? And again, just like all other phenomena of Thumos, it involves an awareness of myself relative to a group, and awareness of that position as good or bad, right? So what happens in anger is, as it were, somebody pushes me from my perceived position in a group. So Thumos is especially aware of that. Another great text from the Politics, so the power of command and the love of freedom are in all men based on this quality, for Thumos is commanding and invincible, right? So related to anger, we'll talk about this momentarily, but Aristotle thinks that in some situations, anger is called for, right? Why? Because he says if there's literally never anger, even for example, if you see an innocent being tortured, right? It's like, hey, this is not the right emotional reaction to reality, right? And anger is supposed to be the kind of spur to the right kind of change, especially when we're talking about kind of defending our communities, defending the people around us, right? So this is why kind of the virtue of courage is very much associated with Thumos in Aristotle's view. But Aristotle says on the flip side as well. Now, Thumos is the quality of the soul which begets friendship and enables us to love, right? So again, think about social rankings, right? And social groups, right? So if I have kind of a bond with another person, it's like, hey, it's not just my place, but it's our place in the social ranking, right? So, and I should say too that the picture you get of Thumos here in Aristotle should be very familiar from what you get in Plato's Republic. So I think they're very much of a piece. So another aspect of Thumos here is that it's especially sensitive to honor, right? So if we think about honor as a kind of social recognition, right, a recognition of our place in a rank, it makes all the sense in the world, right, that Thumos is going to be especially sensitive to honor. And finally, we can think about thumos and the sensitivity to shame, right? So why shame, right? So even if I'm alone, right? Shame involves the recognition of the values of a group, right? And the fact that I've fallen short of those values, right? So again, thumos is that kind of non-rational motivation that enables us to be aware of the fact that I have fallen short. So I hope you can see that kind of as compared with the drive for something like food and drink, and as compared with the capacity for conceptual thought. Thumos is kind of interesting middle place, right? So it's much more sophisticated than what you get with the desire for food, drink, and sex, but it's not quite up there with the capacity for conceptual thought and the use of language. So if that's the kind of basic motivational package that we have, if we are by nature prone to be, angry, ashamed, proud, and all this stuff, it's like, so what do we do with this, right? So how do we shape it well, right? So here's where this idea of moral virtue is so central. And so Aristotle tells us, so we started talking about the three different types of desires. So Aristotle basically gives us this image of the need for harmony, right? Between all three types of desires, right? And given that for humans, the highest capacity that we have is this ability for conceptual thought, this ability to use language. So in the ideal case, the kind of harmony that we have is a harmony where thumos and appetite follow reason, right? And so here's a beautiful passage from Nicomachean Ethics 113. Aristotle writes, no doubt, however, we must nonetheless suppose that in the soul, too, there is something besides reason, resisting it and opposing it. So here, think about appetite and spirit, right? So sometimes reason might say, you shouldn't have a third donut. You've already had 2 donuts and you're full. But appetite resists and opposes, right? Or it's like, man, you're way too angry about this, right? It's like, it's not that big of a deal, right? But thumos resists and opposes, right? Now, even this being that which resists and opposes, seems to have a share in reason, as we said. At any rate, in the continent man, it obeys reason, and presumably in the temperate and brave man, it is still more obedient. So we'll talk about this in a second, but for Aristotle, the continent man is the person who does the right thing, but has to struggle, right? The emotions aren't quite all there in place. Desires aren't quite all there in place. But if you struggle, but you do the right thing, there's a sense in which your thumos and your appetite have followed reason, right? And if your desires are in order, as they are with the temperate man and the brave man, appetite and spirit are even more obedient, right? For in them, it speaks on all matters with the same voice as reason, right? So that's the goal, kind of having spirit and appetite, thumos and appetite speak with the same voice of reason. The Greek there is homophonein, same, it's almost like harmonious, talking about, same harmony as reason, right? The appetitive and in general the desiring element, in a sense, shares in reason, insofar as it listens to and obeys it. This is the sense in which we speak of paying heed to one's father or one's friends. So it's kind of a beautiful image of like, you've kind of have this kind of inner dialogue going on within yourself. It's like, okay, be a friend of yourself and listen to yourself, right? When you're telling yourself to do the right thing, right? The irrational element is in some sense persuaded by reason. That the irrational element is in some sense persuaded by reason is indicated also by the giving of advice and by all reproof and exhortation. So you can think about a friend telling you, it's like, hey, Victor, you shouldn't be that angry. Let me give you 3 reasons why this person didn't mean it. or maybe remember that you were having a bad day, you didn't sleep so well, and after a while, it's not at all uncommon for us to say, okay, that's right, and our anger calms down, right? So that's the kind of thing that Aristotle has in mind. And if this element also must be said to have reason, that which has reason will also be twofold. One subdivision having it in the strict sense and in itself, so this is just rationality straight up, and the other having a tendency to obey it as one does one's father. So appetite and spirit have the tendency to obey reason, even if they don't have reason, strictly speaking, right? So the task of moral virtue will be the task of training spirit, training Thumos to follow reason. Of course, I'm sure you're all wondering the million-dollar question: how the heck do we do that, right? So here Aristotle also has advice. So before we get to that advice, it's important to know kind of what's the goal. What's the goal that we're shooting for? And here Aristotle gives us, kind of following our idea of the continent man, a kind of very rich psychology. So think about the person, different combinations of people who know the right thing to do and do the right thing as well. So something that's, oh goodness, okay, so I'm missing one side of the column over here. That's okay. So key difference. So the virtuous person not only knows the good and does the good, but the part that's missing here, takes pleasure in doing the good, right? Takes pleasure in doing the good. The self-controlled person knows the good, does the good, but doesn't take pleasure in doing the good. The weak-willed person knows the good, does not do the good. It's like, oh man, third donut. Ugh, fine, third donut. There we go, right? So you know the good, I shouldn't be having a third donut. You don't do the good. And needless to say, you don't take pleasure in doing good. And then finally, you have the vicious man who knows the good, who doesn't know the good, I should say, who does not do the good and does not take pleasure in doing the good, right? So if we're thinking about how ought we to shape our thumos, then the crucial goal that we want to be shooting for is up here. So we want to not only know what the right thing is, we want not only to do what the right thing is, but we want to come to a place where we rejoice in doing the right thing, right? So that takes a lot of hard work, right? So Aristotle here gives us an image that's helpful for thinking about how we get there, right? And for any of you who spent any time with Aristotle, it won't be any surprise to hear that you grow in virtue. You grow in your ability not just to know what the right thing is, but to do it and to feel appropriately by doing it, right? It takes practice, right? So here's a wonderful passage from Nicomachean Ethics 2:1. He says, "For it is from playing the lyre that both good and bad lyre players are produced. And the corresponding statement is true of builders and of all the rest. Men will be good or bad builders as a result of building well or badly. For if it were not so, there would have been no need of a teacher, but all men would have been born good or bad at their craft." So relatively straightforward point there. It might seem kind of almost simplistic, but I think it's in fact fundamental, right? So think about building a brick wall, right? I can read about, building a brick wall till the cows come home, but it's only by doing it, right, that I actually learn how to build a brick wall. And moreover, I'm gonna have the need of a good teacher. If I genuinely don't know, how to build a brick wall. I'm going to need some kind of teacher. And further, it's not the case that practice makes perfect, but you need decent enough practice, to make perfect. If your practice is really bad, you're not going to get very far. In fact, you might become a pretty terrible wall builder if you build all these bad habits about how to build a wall, right? So that's why he says men will be good or bad builders as a result of building well or badly, right? And so, okay, how does this help us? This then is the case with the virtues also. So as we're trying to shape our thumos, it'll be the same with the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. And by doing the acts that we do in the presence of danger, and being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly. The same is true of the appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible, by behaving in one way or the other in the appropriate circumstances. Thus, in a word, states arise out of activities, right? So here's something that is, I think, if we kind of zoom out a little bit in thinking about this passage. So Aristotle has given us this kind of famous analogy between learning a craft and acquiring virtue, right? So here are a couple of features that we can kind of extract from this. So number one is that both learning a craft and learning virtue is going to require a teacher, right? So this is the kinds of things that we're going to be needing in both cases. We're going to grow in virtue. You might think about this. Thinking about teachers of virtue might sound high and mighty, but just think about having mentors, right? That's pretty, I think, pretty common practice in lots of areas of life. Second, we can see that both learning a craft and learning virtue requires a kind of targeted practice, right? If I'm going to learn to build in the right way, I'm going to need to practice in the practice in an appropriate way that leads me to be getting better as opposed to getting worse, right? And of course, eventually, this is going to start from applying certain kinds of rules that at first might seem a little bit rote. If anybody here has ever played instruments, it's like you're just kind of playing scales and whatever, right? But eventually you come to understand why that was a good idea, even if it wasn't all that clear to you to begin with, right? So I think this is part of what Aristotle has in mind, right? So if we're going to shape thumos in accordance with reason, we're going to need this kind of targeted practice. And I think there's something kind of really beautiful about the picture that Aristotle paints here. Why? Because it's kind of like ordinary everyday things that you do or don't do. It's like, okay, do I kind of nurse this grudge against this person at work or not, right? It's like, do I keep holding it against this family member that they said this or that? It's like, it's precisely by those little things that we become just or unjust, courageous or not, mild or patient or impatient or whatever, right? So I think it's a beautiful image whereby to think about the practice of virtue in kind of everyday life. So now let's think a little bit about some of the virtues that Aristotle thinks are distinctive to thumos. So first is courage, right? So courage will shape our emotions of fear and confidence, so we can defend our community from unjust threats, right? So, and I should say too, so Aristotle's example, kind of key example of the virtue of courage is, a courageous soldier facing the prospect of death in battle. And it's like, wow, that's not most of us, right? But we can still, by analogy, think about situations that might elicit fear in us at the prospect of a threat. So I think there's plenty of that as well. So for Aristotle, thumos will be involved in the sense of defending what's my own, right, and defending my community, right. So that's going to be central. Here we have, and there's a long quote here, or long stretch of text, but I think it's a really important virtue. So the virtue of magnanimity. So in general, this will shape our disposition towards honor, right? So Aristotle says explicitly again, the virtue of magnanimity is the virtue concerned with honor. But importantly, Aristotle says it'll be central to be attuned towards the right kinds of honor, right? And ultimately, in his view, I think rightly, what's the best kind of honor is the honor that comes from virtue, right? It's like, if you think about it this way, like, should we care about the opinions of all and every person? I think the answer is clearly no. Right? It's there might be some people whose opinions might not be all that important, right? If the National Enquirer puts out this like story about the secret life of Victor Saenz, and I'm like, well, what do I care? It's not that big of a deal, right? But if, in contrast, if the people that I admire the most and who I think are just exemplars of virtue and good people said, hey, Victor, I think something is going seriously wrong with the way you're making this or that decision, I would say, whoa, okay, I should probably think about this, right? So magnanimity is about shaping those desires towards honor, right? And it'll also shape our sense of our own worth and spur us to strive for the highest kinds of goods, right? And in the practical realm, for someone like Aristotle, the highest kinds of goods is going to be a certain kind of moral greatness, right? Whereby we're always striving to outdo ourselves in the exercise of virtue, right? So you can think about it. One of the commentators on magnanimity that I really like, talks about, think about a musician who's got a lot of talent and who works hard. He says, if they're going to be a great musician, he says, I hate to say it, that's not going to cut it, right? They also need a certain kind of ambition, right? It's like, hey, I really want to do well, right? And so one way to thinking about what Aristotle's doing with magnanimity is a kind of moral ambition, right? It's like, hey, my becoming a certain kind of person, a person who sees reality right, and who takes moral character as one of the central values, is going to require a certain kind of ambition, right? It's like you got to really want it, right? So that's part of what's going on with magnanimity, and of course, much of the time this will just look like exercising the virtues that Aristotle highlights in so many places for the right reasons, right? So this will look like acting generously, courageously, justly for the sake of other people. And then finally, very close to home, the virtue of mildness or patience, right? So this is a virtue whereby we shape our impulses towards anger with respect to anger, right? So neither too much, too little, as Aristotle says, highly context sensitive. But I think in all these cases, as we're asking ourselves, how do I grow in these areas? I think Aristotle would counsel, and he does counsel, kind of be aware of where you tend to err, right? Where do you tend to go wrong? It's like, hey, maybe I tend to go wrong because I'm like upset at every other person for every little thing. Maybe my friend tends to err because they don't challenge themselves. They don't have a sense of like, hey, I want to be better, right? So their kind of self-knowledge would be important. And I want to be sure we leave time for Q&A here, but I want to end with a couple of practical conclusions that Aristotle would urge us for here. So big picture, we just got to realize that, as I've mentioned before, so Thumos is this non-rational desire to affirm our place in a social group. You're not going to get rid of it. Right? So the real question is, what do you do with it, right? So with that in mind, maybe first thing is to recognize that it's ultimately not, on his view, the right response to think is like, hey, I don't want to be influenced by social groups. It's like, you're going to. That's how you're wired, right? The right response is finding the right kinds of social groups, right? So it's that's just, I think, involves a deep awareness of the kind of creatures that we are, right? We're as this came out in the politics passage above, for Aristotle, we're kind of like really complicated bees. You don't think of the thriving of a bee outside of the context of a hive, right? So same for humans, right? You always need to think about this in this social setting. And I think two aspects that finding the right kinds of groups are especially or two aspects with respect to which are finding the right kinds of groups is especially important. One is that it can help to spur us to do more and better, right? So it's easy for all of us, right, to kind of be comfortable where we are, right? But in Aristotle's picture, it's like you want to be challenging yourself to be better for the sake of what is good, and that's a team sport, right? So you're going to need others to help you. And I think similarly, the good kind of people, good kind of group, can help to give us a kind of proper sense of shame, right? It's like, hey, we all fall short, right? In an ideal world, we wouldn't need shame, but I think for practical purposes, we all do, right? So having a well-formed sense of shame is also important here. Another conclusion is that we all need targeted practice, right? It's like, so thinking about, okay, what are the specific areas in which my desires need to be better shaped, right? What's a virtue you want to grow in or a vice you need to uproot? And then finally, there's this idea of the need for good mentors, right? So this is in a way just an application of the recognition of a need for a good group, right? If we're going to be striving to form our thumos in the best way possible, we need others who can help us, right? And so if we're going to get down to the nitty gritty, right, that's going to take kind of a person who knows you well and who wants to help you to be better. In other words, you're going to need a virtue friend in Aristotle's terms. So that's all I have for us. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Victor. Excellent presentation. Everyone give a little round of applause for Victor. We have some great questions in the chat. We'll probably only get to like 2 or 3 because we do have a hard stop. So I'm going to sneak mine in. And I was hoping if you could unpack the relationship between honor and shame some more. We used to have a shame educator actually at the Stoa, AJ Bond, who had like a regular shame breakthrough boot camp session. And he had very sophisticated models and practices how to cultivate a better relationship with shame, or what he called toxic shame.
Yeah.
And I hold toxic shame as sort of this free-floating, nebulous, like sticky shame that doesn't have like a clear source. And the argument is that this toxic shame is becoming more prevalent in society, and the whole psychotherapeutic industrial complex is like there to deal with it. And another movement, like I see that's happening as society at large, is this absence of like honor or conversations about honor. Like talking about honor like doesn't seem fashionable, seems out of date. It's like some people think it's itself toxic talking about honor. Yeah. So I'm curious if honor is culturally denied or ignored, or we're shamed. Will it create a culture that's prevalent in toxic shame? So I'm curious how you or Aristotle would view this. And perhaps a more central question is like, what is honor?
Yeah, no, good. So I think you could think about honor just as the recognition of some good, so this is inherently social by nature, right? So, or I should say recognition of some apparent good, because you can distinguish honor of the right kind, where for Aristotle that means recognition of someone's moral good, right, or moral achievement, right, versus just recognition of any old good, right? So I think therefore, if we're thinking about kind of shame, honor, toxic shame, and the like, I think one first thing to note is that given that honor, almost by definition, requires a group and shared values, right? To the extent that you have kind of all these different groups and competing values, it's just going to be really hard to have a shared sense of honor, right? So I think that's part of the reason, I think, why if you're thinking about broader political conversations, I hate to say it, it's sometimes harder and harder, right, to get a sense of shared values. However, right, I think at the level of smaller communities, oh my goodness, you can totally have very thick shared values, right? And I think much as we are rightly paying attention to the national conversation, kind of the most crucial conversations for us tend to happen at a local level, right? So I think that's one big thing. You know, about your comment about kind of toxic shame. So something that's worth mentioning is that Aristotle doesn't spend much time discussing what we would call today things like mental health and things like that, right? So think about something like a problem with self-esteem or something like that, right? So Aristotle doesn't spend much time on that, but clearly, I should say, especially when you're talking about shame, that's important, right? That's really important, right? And so if you're going to talk about shaping your psyche, you know, I think there's a whole other set of tools and concepts that Aristotle isn't privy to, that we're going to need to bring into the conversation. But I think, you know, when talking about, maybe the last thing that I want to say is that in distinguishing between kind of shame and toxic shame, right? Definitely, I think there is you presented toxic shame as this kind of nebulous, undefined kind of sense that I'm maybe like not worth it or something like that, right? Versus what I in Aristotle I think we call a healthy shame is a recognition that, yeah, some things are right and wrong, right? And if I do wrong in a serious way, it's important that I be aware of that, right? Not just mentally, but even emotionally, right? So I think that's where, you know, for Aristotle's picture, I keep coming back to this. We are so social by nature, right? It's going to take good friends and good communities, right, to help us keep that balance between, hey, I did wrong, but let's do this again, right? Versus like, I'm a horrible human being, I don't want to see the light of day type thing. So we're going to be needing other people if they're going to help us make that distinction. Peter, does that make sense?
Yeah, that was an awesome response. Very helpful. So we're going to take in a few other people. Simone, you had a question.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Thank you, Victor. So my question was really, given that Aristotle proposes that reason takes such a central role, being the controller of itself and also of thumos and appetite, how can we make sure that, you know, the reason is operating well, is not kind of infected with negative programming, unhealthy biases? I'm thinking here very much of McGilchrist's left brain, right brain stuff, if you're familiar with that, and left brain just becoming too dominant, which is kind of what you typically associate with the reason. So
yeah, okay, yeah, good. So I think, so if I'm thinking about this rightly, Simone, so are you thinking like right brain kind of more ideals, relationships, big picture, you know, left brain kind of like logic, narrows type stuff? Yeah, no, good. So I think definitely for Aristotle, reason encompasses both. You got to have both, right? So it's not just kind of the kind of very narrow kind of logic chopping. So that's definitely not what he has in mind. I think one thing, you know, a lot to say about your question, but I think one big thing that Aristotle does stress that I think is important. So he's you know, he's very aware about the role of pleasure, good and bad, you know, with respect to forming our reason, right? So how so? So it's something like, you know, to the extent that I find the prospect of something pleasant, right? There's a sense in which, a very clear sense in which I find it attractive, right? So it's a hop, skip, and a jump from finding something attractive to thinking it good, right? So that's where he says, hold on, be careful, right? So, you know, he has this this lovely image of pleasure being sort of like Helen of Troy, right? It's like, okay, so she's lovely, she's beautiful, she's charming, be careful. It's like, so that's the first thing. And I think related to that, or just a corollary of that, is that to the extent that we're able to not be guided just by what is pleasant, full stop, we're also it's the same kind of skill that we need to be able to manage pain, right? So if we're not just going to go for something because it's pleasant, similarly, we don't just want to avoid something because it's painful, right? So I think in both cases, it involves a kind of regulation of desire, such that I'm able to kind of step back. It's like, okay, this is pleasant, this is painful, but this is good, right? And if we're going to have the kinds of substantive conversations that we need to have about where reason ought to direct us, we need to be able to do that, right? It's like, let me not just jump on a conclusion because it's the kind of thing that I like, right? And let me not just avoid a conclusion or a conversation because it's unpleasant to have, right? So I think that would be central for Aristotle's picture. Does that help?
Yeah, I think what you said at the start with he sees reasoning as both, and the kind of cultivation of that is really important. But yeah, thank you.
Great, for sure.
Thank you, Simone. Todd, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentation. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about Aristotle's view on intuition, or at least what we kind of call intuition today, because in listening to your description of kind of the tripartite soul idea of appetites, thumos, and reason, I feel like I can grasp kind of the top two layers of appetite and desire relatively quickly, sort of in where I am right now, but thumos is still something that I'm wrestling with, and I'm just wondering if it has, in your mind, any connection to sort of our modern conceptions of intuition, and then how do those intuitions get shaped or not shaped by our reason?
Yeah, no, good. So if we're thinking about intuition as something like, oh, I kind of sense this, I don't feel like I have a good kind of immediate chain of reasoning that justifies it, but I just kind of sense this or something like that. So I would say that Aristotle thinks about kind of thumos is very, very different from that. So the kind of the main thing to think about thumos is that it involves a kind of awareness of myself relative to a group, right? My position of that group relative to the group as positive or negative. And thumos is the desire to affirm my place in that group, right? We see that in anger, right? We see that in the pursuit of honor, right? But it's also my desire it also can be a desire to avoid what denies my place, right? As we see in shame and things like this. So again, if we're thinking about kind of at a very kind of fundamental level, what is thumos? It's this kind of very rich desire to affirm my place in a social ranking and avoid what denies my place in a social ranking. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
It does. Thank you.
Good.
Awesome. Maybe we'll sneak in one or two more. Fred, you had a question.
Victor, thanks for taking the time out to share your experience with Aristotle. I was thinking about, let me go grab my question. I was thinking about teachers of moral courage and or mentors, that two different roles they could take. They could model virtuous behavior themselves, or maybe perhaps second, they could empower their mentee to make mistakes and discover consequences for themselves. What would Aristotle say about that? Are there different requirements for mentees at different stages? I was also thinking of parents and children.
Oh yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. So on the one hand, what Aristotle gives us is, I think, rich, largely true, but very schematic, right? About what it's going to look like between mentor and mentee, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, it's delightful to see that there's been actually a lot of kind of scholarship and scholarly work kind of into this kind of thing. And in a way, the kind of answer that we get is one that we would expect from Aristotle. And this, in some ways, feels like a cop-out, is that it's context sensitive. It depends, right? So, but I think we can say some useful things. So there's a lovely book which some of you might like here, by Christian Miller, called The Character Gap. So it's a book written for a popular audience of intelligent readers like you all. And some of the things that he has towards the end of the book are, what are some research-backed ways of helping people to grow in character, right? And interesting in thinking about children, for example, is precisely this idea of stories, right? Having stories with moral exemplars, right? And so Miller did kind of a lot of research on the kind of emotion of admiration, right? And how admiration can be morally motivating, right? So kind of presenting children with stories, for sure, is one way to do this. But I think one of the things too, so you kind of alluded to this, is that it's like, yeah, you might model the behavior yourself, or you might just let the person make mistakes, right? But which is the right thing to do? It's going to be extremely context sensitive, right? Extremely context sensitive. Does that make sense, Fred?
Yeah, I was also thinking about like St. Peterson, is he at Penn, who developed the rubric, of all the character virtues, and taking the kind of some of the positive psychology, 21st century, and categorizing different virtues and developing techniques for augmenting them. As you say, the introspective psychological aspect is not part of Aristotle's vocabulary. We didn't have egos
That's right.
years ago, the same way we do now.
That's right. That's right.
So that I don't find that context dependent quite as weaselly. It's not a weasel to me. We just have different categories we have to apply to it. So
that's right.
Thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Fred. So we have 5 minutes, so we'll sneak in one quick question. Kevin, you had a question.
Hey, Victor. This seems like a kind of Aristotle 101 question, but maybe you can shed some light. In the quote you were saying about like where virtues come from, he suggests the needs of virtuous teachers as role models. Like, what is his belief on where these virtues or role models come from? Like, how do they arise in human nature to distinguish us from animals? Is it from the gods, or the conventional evolutionary kind of talk piece would be that they, it was beneficial for us to have honor and shame for evolutionary reasons. But I'm wondering what the Aristotle take is on where these virtues came from.
Yeah. So are you thinking?
Or how do we find them today? Yeah. Or how do we find them today, as Peter said also?
Yeah. So Kevin, is your question more about like where, according to Aristotle, do we find good mentors, or why we need good mentors?
I think like where like virtues actually came from, right? Like, are they from the gods?
Yeah.
Like sort of more of a metaphysical question.
Oh, I see. Okay, got it. No, great, good. So so Aristotle, Aristotle definitely has a conception of God, and it is playing a role in his thinking about virtue. But it's much more oblique role. I think if you ask, to go back to your question, Kevin, so where does this come from? I think it's going to be largely a function of the kind of creature that we are, right? So it's so think about it this way, right? So Aristotle says that something like the practice of adultery, right, is always wrong, right? So he's got this kind of view about intimate relationships, right? But imagine if we were the kind of creature that reproduced asexually, right? It's like, okay, then there wouldn't be any norms about adultery, right? So, or imagine if we were the kind of creature that was not social by nature, right? So apparently, so I am told, like the snow leopard is not a social animal, And apparently, like clams are not social animal, right? Social animals, right? So if we were not social by nature, we probably have different norms about how we ought to relate to other people, right? Similarly, imagine, so Aristotle thinks, truthfully, that we're material beings, right? Imagine if we were like angels or something like this. We wouldn't need private property, right? We wouldn't need property at all, right? So there probably wouldn't be norms against theft or something like this, right? So all this to say, Kevin, that for Aristotle, if we ask where are the virtues coming from, it's in no small part coming from the kind of creature that we are, right? So that's the kind of answer he would give.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. So we're approaching the top of the hour. We'll gently close here. Victor, do you have any parting thoughts for us that you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, gosh. So I guess my only thought would be that there's this kind of deep awareness in Aristotle of kind of the need for us to be in kind of the right social setting. There's a wonderful book, called Ordinary Men, talking about Germans in the Second World War, right? So some of you might be aware of this. And the question the researchers wanted to ask is, how is it that seemingly ordinary men, not part of the Nazi army or anything like this, who were just kind of conscripted into doing these things, how did they end up doing such atrocious things like decimating Polish villages, killing lots of innocent people? And basically the answer they came to, it was the influence of the group, right? So I guess my parting comment, again, thinking here about Thumos, is that it's so central that we surround ourselves by good people, right? So that's Aristotle's take on this, I think.
Amen. I can stand by that statement. So we'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Victor, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. That was quite an awesome session. And now, in a minute, we're going to jump on a different link. If you would like to join us at the Stoa for collective coaching, this is Unique Bird's 4-part series where she engages in theory U coaching methodology and a collective context, hopefully for create a culture of virtue. And then tomorrow, Thumos Awareness Week continues. Thumos models mind, motivation, and emotion in Homer with Douglas. So check that out tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So that being said, Victor, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Good to
Victor.
be with you all.